Good afternoon, good evening, good morning from wherever you are joining us from. This is Skip Weisman, the workplace communication expert, helping you build your championship companies with a special event here today for all of my participants in my championship company blog. And that is my special friend and colleague, Catherine Matisse, the workplace bullying expert. And I'm really excited to have Catherine with us on today's webinar. I've met Catherine. Actually, we've never physically met in person, but we've been talking for the last probably 6 months or so. When I reached out to her, I was actually doing some research online for some of the work that I do, and I'm getting ready to launch a new white paper report called Your Ideal Work Environment. And in researching some of that work, I came across, upon Catherine's work, and it really resonated with me. I thought it was really great work that she's doing, and would be a great resource to supplement some of the stuff I'm doing and the folks that you guys come to me for and read on my blog and engage with me on the other programs. I thought this Catherine's work would be a real great piece of information you need to learn from. And so Catherine is president of a consulting and training firm called Civility Partners. She's been successfully providing programs in workplace bullying and building positive workplaces since 2007, just about the time that I got started as well, which is kind of interesting. And she's worked with the third largest energy company in the world, hospitals, nonprofits, universities, and a huge array of other businesses, both large and small. Catherine is considered a real expert in the field and has traveled the world speaking on the topic of bullying. She's one of the founding members of the National Workplace Bullying Coalition and currently serves as the organization's president. She has co-authored a book called Back Off, Your Kick-Ass Guide to Ending Bullying at Work, and was blessed to have Ken Blanchard write the foreword. And in it, Ken Blanchard said it was the most comprehensive and valuable handbook on the topic of workplace bullying. She recently released a second book, which is titled Seeking Civility, How Leaders, Managers, and HR Can Create a Workplace Free of Bullying, and those both books are both available on Amazon. So, Catherine, welcome to my world, and everybody who's been joining us from all over the world, I guess, from the registrations it looks like. I'm really excited to hear your insights on workplace bullying. Thank you for agreeing to do this program, and I will turn things over to you and start the discussion.
All right, thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it. So we're going to go through a ton of stuff over the next hour and 20 minutes or so, and my goal is to give you a ton of information for solving the problem of workplace bullying. So I definitely recommend, I know it's easy when we're watching webinars to kind of feel like we're going to do 3 different things at once, but I absolutely recommend that you turn off any of those distractions, turn your email down, turn off your phone, close your door, give yourself this time to learn. As I said, I'm just going to give you a huge amount of information over the next hour and 20 minutes or so. Now, you might be wondering if you're in the right place or not. Just wanted to kind of give you an idea of who this webinar is targeted towards. Anybody essentially who's an influencer in any way, shape, or form. So if you're watching this as a team lead of some kind, or a project manager, or a supervisor, or human resources, or anybody who can sort of influence the team, then most of the tips I'm going to give are around kind of that area, you know, influencing the world right around you and influencing your company. Some of the tips I'm going to give are more organizational tips that require, you know, an entire organization to be on board. A lot of the other tips I'm going to give you are more about just sort of individual influence. So there's a wide array of information that you'll get, and hoping that a lot of it resonates with you, of course. So we're essentially going to cover 3 topics. I'm going to start off by defining workplace bullying for you. I'm going to talk with you about harassment versus bullying because I get that question a lot, and so I'm going to drill into that. I'll give you 7 points that are differentiators between harassment and bullying. And then I'll essentially give you 10 steps for solving the problem of bullying. Now, if you implement all 10 of my steps, I absolutely can guarantee that you will not have workplace bullying anymore. So I know that's a strong statement, but I've been doing this for a long time. I've worked with a ton of different organizations, and I know that if you implement these 10 steps, you will no longer have workplace bullying. I wanted to point you to the workbook. I sent out a few emails with a link to the workbook. If you didn't get those emails or didn't get a chance to download the workbook, there's a handouts section there in your webinar bar, and you can print the workbook right now if you'd like. Also wanted to say too that this is meant to be interactive. I've got my questions window open, so if you have anything you want to say, any questions you have, I'm happy to answer those questions as we're going through. It's a lot more fun for me and a lot more interesting and informative for you if you are able to interact with me. So please feel free to do so. So Skip introduced me, and I appreciate that bio, Skip, but I wanted to tell you my story just because people are often asking me, how in the world did you come to be involved in workplace bullying, and I wanted to share that with you. I was the director of human resources for a nonprofit organization here in San Diego where I live, and actually found myself working with a bully. At the time when I first started working there, I recognized that he was going to make my life miserable. I could see he was making a lot of other people's lives miserable, but I didn't really know what it was or why it was happening. But I was sort of fascinated by it because we were in a fairly large organization, and here we'd let this one person sort of rise to the top and really be a bully. During that time while I was working there, I started getting my master's degree at San Diego State in organizational communication, and had to write a paper on something dark for one of my classes. We were learning about kind of negative human interactions and all that kind of stuff. And so I had to write a paper on something negative happening in my world, and I decided to write a paper on this person. And that's when I came across the phrase workplace bullying. And it turns out there's about 30 years of academic research on the topic of workplace bullying, and America is actually really far behind in terms of laws. So a lot of other countries actually have laws against workplace bullying. America does not. We have 4 states that have laws about workplace bullying. For example, California requires that our mandatory sexual harassment training include a little conversation about workplace bullying, but that's about the extent of our laws. So I was just really fascinated by what I was reading, and ever since that paper that I wrote in graduate school, I have been obsessed with workplace bullying. Every other paper I wrote in grad school was on that topic. My thesis was on that topic. I actually dedicated my thesis to the Post-it Nazi, which is what we called the workplace bully that I worked with, and he knows I dedicated my thesis to him, so I guess 1 point for me. And so the thing about that scenario was I felt bullied personally, but as the director of HR, I also saw all of the problems he was creating for the organization. So I've experienced bullying as sort of a target, and also as an organizational person trying to solve it from an organizational standpoint. And so that definitely shows up in my methodology and how I try to solve bullying. And since that paper, since graduate school, I've just made it my mission to solve the problem of bullying, and created a company, Civility Partners, around this problem, wrote a book, as Skip mentioned, and then most recently wrote a second book called Seeking Civility. I've been published in a huge array of venues, and I've worked with a huge variety of clients. And so my experience really, goes across the gamut. So with that, let's go ahead and jump right in. So the first place to start is to talk about what bullying is so we can get it defined. Well, workplace bullying has 3 facets. The first is that it's repeated. So workplace bullying is always something that is pervasive, repeated, ongoing. We're not talking about a one-time offense where somebody was acting unprofessional or uncivil, and then everybody got over it and it was fine and we moved on. Workplace bullying is ongoing. In fact, the researchers, they need to quantify things in order to study them. Researchers say that workplace bullying happens about once a week for a period of 6 months, and then it sort of, counts as bullying. So that's the first piece, is that it's repeated. The next piece of the definition is that it creates a psychological power imbalance. So this is what makes workplace bullying different than conflict. Conflict happens when you have two people who disagree, but they both have a voice. In bullying, one person's voice is completely squashed out and the other person has an extraordinarily loud and aggressive voice. And so there's this power imbalance. So what happens in terms of how bullying unfolds is you have an initial bullying scenario where the bully either rolls their eyes in a staff meeting or sends out some sort of nasty email or does something that, is uncivil, unprofessional. And for whatever reason in that scenario, the target does not speak up. So the bully mostly subconsciously sort of recognizes, oh, I sent a nasty email and that person didn't speak up for themselves. So then maybe a few weeks later they send another nasty email and again the target doesn't speak up. And so then at a staff meeting they make a nasty comment and the target again doesn't say anything and neither does anybody else. And so over time these behaviors become more and more frequent and more aggressive until eventually there's this power imbalance that exists. And so the behavior sort of unfolds like a crescendo where there's this initial incident at the beginning and then eventually the power imbalance just gets greater and greater and greater and the behaviors become more and more frequent and more aggressive. The third piece of the definition is that this absolutely causes harm to targets and witnesses. So people who feel bullied absolutely experience anxiety, stress, depression, fear, confusion, being mistreated at work, being abused at work certainly causes people to feel very unhappy and very unsettled and they feel sort of lost. They're confused by what's going on. They're confused by the fact that nobody's speaking up for them. Their family is often confused, so they'll come home from work and share these stories and the people around them don't necessarily understand what's going on unless they've experienced it too. So it's a very tumultuous experience to go through if you feel bullied. And of course, it's no secret that stress causes physical problems as well. So as targets become stressed and depressed ultimately from their experience, they're not sleeping well, they're not eating, they're getting headaches, heartaches, stomach aches. And so physically and psychologically, targets are certainly feeling some level of damage. But it's also important to know that witnesses feel that too. So it's not just the people who self-identify as being bullied that experience this. People who go to work every day and they see that John is really picking on Susan, that bothers them. And they wonder why managers aren't stepping in and they wonder what they're supposed to do about it and they're afraid that they're next and that kind of thing. So people who are around the bullying are also experiencing some damage. So from there, let's talk about some behaviors, and then I'm going to check in with you and see how this is resonating with you. So there are a million lists of bullying behaviors. If you look at any sort of article about workplace bullying, it will often provide a list of examples. What I noticed in looking at all of those lists and also looking at surveys that researchers use in, which are essentially lists of bullying behaviors, I noticed that there's constantly this pattern that no matter what behaviors you look at for an example, they always fall into one of the following three buckets. So there's ultimately three buckets of bullying behavior. The first is aggressive communication. So this is communication that you can see. This is nasty emails, getting in someone's personal space, cowering over someone, kind of harsh finger pointing or harsh gestures or nonverbal communication, taunting someone on social media. So this is anything that you can really see. This is the most obvious kind of bullying behavior. One example that I can share, I was an expert witness on a court case against a very large retailer, and in that situation, this manager would sort of cower over people and kind of back them up, as he's sort of cowering over them and getting in their space, they're backing away from him. And, at that point, we're sort of looking at level 1 violence because people are, physically afraid of this as he's cowering over them. But a couple times he actually stuck his finger in the person's nose in order to fishhook them to keep them from backing away. So now that there's touching, we really have crossed over into workplace violence. So that's an example of aggressive communication, but it's also an example of how easily workplace bullying, which is technically legal, can cross over into illegal behaviors. The next bucket of behaviors is humiliation. So doing things that leave the target embarrassed, humiliated, lost and confused. So some of the examples there might be pointing out mistakes in public, constantly pointing out mistakes to managers or leaders, not letting mistakes go. And so, we all make mistakes at work, but a bully can really kind of hone in on a mistake and beat it to death. And that's not fair. If someone makes a mistake, you fix it, you correct it, you talk about it, you coach, and then you move on. But if a bully is sort of hanging on to that mistake, then that's humiliating. Hazing would be an example of humiliation. So doing things that leave the target feeling embarrassed and humiliated. The last bucket of bullying behavior is manipulation. So as you may have noticed, as I've gone from aggressive communication to humiliation to manipulation, the behaviors are becoming more and more passive aggressive. So unfortunately, bullies recognize that they can't necessarily throw people up against their locker and steal their lunch money like we might do in high school. So as adults, we're a lot more sophisticated in how we abuse people, and therefore manipulation is the most, Skip's chuckling at my comment. We're more sophisticated, we're better communicators, and we recognize that workplace violence isn't okay. So if you're a bully, you're definitely using manipulation as your number one tactic because it's passive aggressive and you can sort of have an excuse for why you acted a certain way. So some examples, using performance evaluations to claim that somebody is a poor performer when maybe they're not, giving someone so much work that it's impossible to complete it, giving someone impossible deadlines, taking someone's major responsibilities away from them so they're left without anything that's important, or so they're left without a key piece of their job. And again, these are all things, for example, taking responsibilities from someone. Maybe there's some organizational change. Maybe that's what needed to happen. And so it's not bullying to just take a behavior or take a responsibility from someone, but it's bullying if you don't communicate about why you took the behavior away or the responsibility away, and what's happening. If you just take it with no rhyme or reason or explanation, then that can feel like bullying. To give you some examples, one woman asked me to help her write a letter to the EEOC. She was filing a harassment complaint and was also going to include some bullying in there. And one of the behaviors that she experienced, in addition to being yelled at and humiliated in front of her peers and receiving nasty emails, her boss actually gave her 60 case files, and everybody else in the office had 30 case files. So she had double the work of everybody else. And she was very vocal and verbal about how she wasn't able to keep up with her workload and consistently asked her manager for help. Could she farm out some of these files? Could she get an assistant? Could she have overtime? She was looking for assistance in dealing with this double caseload. And the manager kept telling her, no, you have to do it. I know you can do it. I have faith in you. You've been here a long time. And then when performance evaluation time comes around, she's told that she's a poor performer and she's being recommended for a demotion. She can't keep up with her workload. So that's manipulation. You know, she'd been saying, I can't keep up with my workload. I have double the work. And so then to have that on her performance evaluation was really hurtful. So that's an example. Other examples are punitively punishing people. So I hear that a lot. So bullies may punish a target who's 5 minutes late for work, but then their colleague or their buddy or one of the coworkers that they like, that person's a half an hour late and nothing's done about it. So the bullies, you know, sort of picking and choosing who they want to punish and why. So with that, I'm just curious, are these things resonating with you? Do these buckets resonate with you? I'd love to see some comments from you all. And Skip, maybe you have a comment.
Yeah, and all three of them resonate. I hear about them and experience some of them. The first one, the real physical, aggressive communication, about 6 or 7 years ago, I had a client who owned a small business. He had 25 employees, and he was the bully. And he was very aggressive in his communication style, and basically just shot everybody down in public. So he, the one aggressive communication led to humiliation, right in the workplace. So it was a double whammy there.
Yeah, yeah. Any other comments on this? Any thoughts on it? It looks like some people are typing, but I'm not, I'm seeing, that's my question. What do you do when the CEO is the bully? So Skip, I'll let you answer that and then I'll give my answer.
Well, it was interesting. The CEO, the owner of the company, was the one who actually brought me in to help improve motivation and morale in the workplace. And so I had to have a very frank, candid conversation with him that, well, the reason there's a low morale and motivation in the workplace is your communication style. And so obviously he was investing in me to help improve his work environment, so he was open to the conversation, realizing that he had to change if he wanted to change his employees. So from that perspective, it was an easier conversation than it might have been otherwise. But in that situation, you've got to have somebody, I would think, who is has a high trust relationship with the CEO, who can bring some of this to light, because oftentimes they just have a blind spot about it. Either they have a blind spot about it, or they just, they have no compassion and don't care. But I think at that level, they should, because it's impacting performance of everybody else. So I think I would say you look for who that influencer is on the senior team that could have that conversation or bring it to light, to ask him or her to adjust their behavior, or at least let them know what the impact of their behavior is.
Yeah, and Mary, that's Skip's answer is right in line with mine. So your story about your experience with that, probably few and far between. So that's awesome that you were able to kind of get him there under different circumstances and then be honest with him. But Mary, yeah, in terms of the CEO being the bully, just know that most of the time when people are bullies or engage in this behavior, they're not doing it purposefully, in the sense that they're not coming to work every morning, set on making everybody's life miserable. They're just aggressive people, and they just don't recognize how damaging their behavior is. And often when confronted with this information that people really are being sort of damaged by your behavior, they're often pretty surprised. So bullies often recognize that they're seen as kind of a hard manager, they're rough around the edges, but they don't see just how bad it goes or how deep the hurt runs. So find an influencer, somebody who works with the CEO that the CEO trusts, and maybe that influencer can have the conversation, and then maybe the CEO is open to some sort of executive coaching or communication coaching, or working with Skip, to help resolve that. So.
Yeah, and also a lot of it at that level, in that situation, I think a lot of it comes down to emotional intelligence. At least in the client that I had, there were certain things, certain triggers that would set them off, and so it was really being able to have him sort of calibrate and adjust his style, his emotional reaction to those triggers, and because there were certain patterns that we could see that he needed to adjust the way he responded in situations based on those triggers.
Yeah, yeah. So hopefully we've answered your question, Mary, and we're happy to continue that conversation offline if you'd like. Some of the other comments I'm seeing are that these behaviors do resonate with people. One person says that they suffered from these behaviors and they didn't receive any assistance. Another person says that they've been a target already at this point. Let's see, the director was the person doing it. So yeah, bullying is definitely a social phenomenon. It's not something that's just the bully and the target who live in a vacuum together. It's about the entire organization. And as we go through the 10 steps, you'll find that most of them are focused on the organization itself as opposed to an individual. So I can certainly have a separate conversation about, kind of protecting yourself, and that's what my book Back Off was about. But ultimately it's the organization's responsibility to solve it. So with that, I want to talk to you about the difference between bullying versus harassment, or the differences and similarities, because this is a kind of a sticky spot. So know first off that bullying and harassment are the same thing in terms of behaviors. So if you were to read any sort of case about sexual harassment or discrimination or harassment, you would see that ultimately the behaviors are bullying. They all fit in the same 3 buckets that I just gave you regarding bullying. So the behaviors are the same. Another similarity is that they both cause power imbalance or psychological power imbalance. So what's interesting though is that when you look at academic definitions of workplace bullying, they always focus on the psychological power imbalance. That's a key component of the definition. Versus harassment, the law doesn't actually ever mention power. So academic definitions of bullying always talk about power imbalance. Harassment is a legal definition, does not talk about power imbalance. However, this is ultimately something these 2 behaviors have in common, because if you're being sexually harassed or harassed because of your race, religion, disability, or whatever protected category, then certainly you would feel a level of psychological power imbalance. So harassment is also abuse, just like workplace bullying is. One other thing they have in common is the perpetrator. So the law does actually say that a perpetrator of harassment can be anybody. So employers are required to protect employees from a vendor who might sexually harass or discriminate against their employees. They're obviously required to protect their employees from managers, supervisors, and fellow employees. So the law says harassment can come from anybody. And same with bullying. Bullying can happen from any level, and it can happen, from any person to another person. The research does find that 70% of the time, the bullying is a manager bullying a subordinate, or a leader bullying a subordinate. And 30% of the time, the bullying is either peer-to-peer, or the person is bullying their superior. So for example, in my situation, when I experienced bullying, this person and I were both director level, and we both reported directly to the president. So he was not my manager. I didn't even work in the same department as he did, but he definitely bullied me, and he actually bullied the president, not to the extent that he bullied everybody else, but he was a pretty harsh communicator, even in the way he spoke to the president. And then he certainly bullied several subordinates in his own department and in other departments. The last thing that these 2 things have in common is ultimately repetition. So harassment, the Title VII, the law regarding harassment, uses the word pervasive, that the behavior has to be pervasive. So you could not, as an employee, you could not sue your employer for a one-time offense regarding harassment. But if this behavior is going on and on and on and on, and the organization doesn't do anything to put a stop to it, then you could sue. So the behavior has to be pervasive. And same goes for workplace bullying. You always see repeated in the definition. It's always listed as an ongoing kind of behavior. Some things they do not have in common. The first and biggest piece is the protected category. So the behaviors are the same, but the difference is that when those behaviors are aimed at a protected category, like age, race, disability, nationality, gender orientation, there's a huge list of protected categories. If the bullying behaviors are aimed at someone because they belong to a protected category, we call that harassment, and that's illegal. If the bullying is equal opportunity harassment and there is no protected category connected to the behavior, then it's bullying. So what's interesting about this too is that I've had several employment law attorneys tell me that when they've read case law about harassment, really what's happening is it's bullying. It's just aggressive behavior that's not linked to the protected category, but because that person is part of a protected category, they were able to sue. So for example, in Tennessee, there's a law about workplace bullying. The assemblyman who had it passed, his name is Antonio Parkinson, he's African American and was working in the fire department and was bullied by a white person. And so we had a conversation about it, and he's telling me this story, and I said to him, well, isn't that harassment? The guy's white, you're black, that's harassment. And his answer was, no, he wasn't bullying me because I'm black. He was bullying me because he was threatened by me, and and all these other reasons. So I couldn't say that it was harassment. But most people in his scenario would have claimed harassment and taken the legal steps. So just to kind of clarify that for you, what we're doing here, what we're talking about. Couple more things here. Intent is also something that seems to be different. So the law actually specifically says that intention is not required, and it's still harassment whether somebody intended to harass somebody else or not. So intention is totally irrelevant. It's still illegal. In workplace bullying, there's a bit of a disconnect or a conversation happening there among the field experts. So many people do seem to believe that bullying is intentional, and many people believe that it is not intentional. In my own experience, I haven't seen that it's intentional. As I mentioned when we were talking about the one question about the CEO, most often people recognize that they're seen as hard or a tough exterior kind of a person, but they're not, they're not doing it intentionally. They're not intending to cause the kind of harm that they cause. So ultimately, I think this is something they have in common, though in the world of bullying, we're still kind of working through that. And then finally, subjectivity. So in harassment, a person can sue their employer for harassment even if they didn't receive any harm or didn't, if they're, whether or not they're psychologically or physically damaged as a result of the harassment is irrelevant, they can still sue. It's still illegal. In workplace bullying, we seem to really focus on the harm, and that's always a big part of the conversation when we're talking about bullying. So ultimately, to recap, the two things you need to remember that the behaviors are the same. What makes them different is the protected category scenario. But now you can have a kind of a longer discussion about it. So one other thing we need to talk about is that bullying is definitely social. So as I mentioned, bullies and targets aren't functioning in a vacuum. The whole organization plays a role, though certainly bullies and targets play a role in the scenario. So let's talk about that for a second. I'm curious, what do you all think about the characteristics that a bully brings to the table? Why would someone be a bully, or what makes them a bully, or what's happening there that somebody is being aggressive? Just curious on your thoughts there. Insecurity. What else? What are your thoughts, Skip, while people are typing in their answers?
Yeah, well, I think insecurity or low self-esteem, comes to the forefront. The other thing I thought of was in some way they feel threatened, so they have to be aggressive and lash out. because they feel under attack in some way.
Yes, absolutely. So we've got some of those same things. Threatened by a strong female, they want to be the boss, they're looking for power, they don't understand boundaries, they need to be aggressive. Okay, so these are all absolutely correct. They have hatred and homophobia, perhaps, so then we're now talking about harassment. Bullies are paying people back for the harm done to them. Okay, so they feel damaged and they're sort of lashing out. Um, Strong personality and used to getting their own way, absolutely. They've gotten away with it in the past, absolutely. So these are all absolutely correct answers. So the fact of the matter is that people learn how to bully over time. So they lash out, they act aggressively at some point in their life, and nobody says anything to them. They're not taught other ways, and ultimately they learn that they can get what they need by acting this way. And so they're lacking social and emotional intelligence, they're lacking empathy and communication skills, they're lacking the ability to really see how they're affecting the people around them. Certainly they are sort of power hungry, they're looking to feel powerful, and that's one way to get power, much like an addict. You know, they feel this strong desire to feel powerful, and bullying is one way to achieve that. So the target also plays a role in this whole scenario. Now, I just want to be clear, I'm not blaming targets or saying they deserve it. Certainly not. I was bullied. I certainly didn't deserve to be treated the way I was treated. However, bullying is a relationship that develops over time, and so the target does play a role in that relationship. And targets ultimately are, researchers find that they're actually pretty high producers. So talking about, you know, bullies feeling threatened, absolutely. They feel threatened by this strong producer, and that may be one reason they're sort of going after them. But, you know, that may not be the case. Going back to Skip's example with the CEO, he wanted people to perform, so his bullying was maybe coming from a place of passion, wanting people to succeed because he wants his company to succeed, as opposed to feeling threatened. Um, One person says, in my experience, upper management can encourage behavior because they get results. And that's absolutely true. I'm actually trying to get a client right now who we're going in this round and around where the HR wants to fix, quote unquote, her behavior, but the C-suite isn't necessarily on board because she is a high producer. So they're kind of like, well, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. And HR is saying, but it is broke. It's gonna, you know, it's going down a path, and eventually it's gonna, something's gonna happen, and then you'll wish you'd fixed it. So has that been your experience too, Skip? Have you seen that kind of thing?
Yeah, in a lot of different ways, not just the bullying mentality, but somebody just sort of has an attitude problem or rubs people the wrong way, or not even at the bullying level, but high performers seem to get special dispensation because we don't want to rock the boat, and where they're going to be tough to replace at that, what they're quote producing,
Right.
and senior leaders are, wary of doing anything that's going to impact that performance, and they don't see the other side of how it's impacting the rest of everybody else's performance.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So it's a little bit of a conundrum. One other person says that sometimes they're nice in public and bully in private, and that's true too. Bullies often recognize they have to act a certain way around one group of people, and then they can sort of bully around the other. Now, as I mentioned, the relationship between the bully and target is one of ultimately power imbalance that develops over time, and the power imbalance becomes more and more great. But organizational members also play a role in this. So again, this isn't happening in a vacuum. Unless the bully and target work together, just the two of them, and nobody else is around, if there's organizational members around, they play a role. Now, my colleagues call organizational members bystanders or witnesses. I don't like either of those words because they make it sound like those people are don't have a choice, or that they're sort of innocent passerbys in the whole thing. I disagree with that. If I go to work every day and I see John bullying Susan and it's going on and on, if I don't say anything, either if I don't speak up to John and say, hey John, what's the deal? Why are you picking on Susan? Or if I don't go to HR, or if I don't go to managers, if I don't do anything about it or try to step in, then that makes me a reinforcer. That is a choice that I've made. It's a conscious choice that I've made, and therefore I'm reinforcing the behavior. So one of the keys to solving bullying is getting the organizational members to feel comfortable to speak up, and there's a lot that goes into that that we'll talk about. But you see this in school-age bullying too, where the bystander effect, or the upstander is the new word, where let's get kids to stand up for the person being bullied, and so the social pressure will ultimately stop the bullying. So of course, as organizational members don't speak up, they are supporting the bully and causing damage to the target. On the other side, the organization itself plays a role in the whole bullying situation. So there are organizational factors that have been clearly showing that they're related to bullying. So for example, if you have a bureaucratic organization where there's a lot of rules and regulations and forms and processes, the organization is slow moving, it's easier to bully in that scenario because you can sort of hide and you're buried in the weeds because you're in this bureaucratic organization, and then you can use the tools the organization's provided you to bully. Another organizational norm is when you have high stress environment or high competition, when you have organizations where a lot of people who work there have worked there for a long time, so a lot of tenured employees, when you have a lot of people who are very smart, so that's why we see a lot of bullying in higher education, at universities, in hospitals, among nurses. That's part of what's at play there, is a lot of people who are smart and feel that they know what's best, and they're not interested in hearing other people's opinions. Um, the other major organizational norm that's consistently linked to bullying is what researchers literally call weak leadership. So when the leaders are not willing to speak up against bullying, then of course bullying will thrive. And so of course all of that is supporting the bully and causing damage to the target. Meanwhile, and what's so fascinating about this is, as organizations allow bullying to thrive, the bully is damaging the organization itself, and it's damaging the organizational members, and it's of course damaging the target. So the bully isn't offering the same level of support to the organization as the organization is offering to the bully. So before we jump into my 10 steps, I just wanted to give you kind of my stairway to heaven, because I believe that workplace civility is ultimately the key to meeting the organization's bottom line. And so when you have civility, you have people who feel that they can grow. And there's a great book by a gentleman named Kim Cameron. It's called Positive Leadership, and he comes from positive psychology. And so he studies what makes people happy and how happiness drives our ability to thrive inside organizations. And he studies the positive communication and how even just saying thank you to people can really make a difference in how they perform. And so he talks about the fact that that people are a lot like plants. We grow towards the light and we grow towards the sun. We don't thrive in dark, scary places. We thrive in light, sunshiny places where we feel like we can grow. And so we need civility for that, because when you have civility, you have better relationships, you have better communication. So you don't have to like everybody you work with, but you have to treat them with civility. And when you do that, then they're willing to talk to you. And when we're talking to each other as employees, we're making better decisions, we're more innovative, we're learning more, and therefore we're engaged and we're loyal. So adults have to feel like they have to grow, and we like to grow professionally and personally over the course of our lives, and being able to work with our colleagues to be innovative and learn from each other and learn from our mistakes and celebrate our differences and all of those things allow us to feel engaged and motivated, which means that we're coming to work and therefore we're producing and engaging in positive customer service, and then we can meet our goals and have bottom line results. So you have to have civility in order to get bottom line results. So let's go ahead and jump right into my 10 steps. So these are the 10 steps that you need to solve workplace bullying. The first two steps go hand in hand. You absolutely have to have leadership on board. And sometimes the way to do that is through what's called a prevalence audit. So leadership has to be open to solving the problem of bullying. They have to be transparent about the fact that they're not going to tolerate bullying anymore. You know, leadership absolutely has to be on board and say, no, this has got to stop. We've got to make a difference. And leadership has to be on board with having a certain kind of organizational culture. You can't build a culture, you know, without the CEO on board with that culture. Now, that said, if you're somebody who's listening in right now and you're not anywhere near the CEO and you don't have the ability to influence the entire organization's culture, I'll say that you can influence the culture inside your own work team or inside your own department. So, you know, you still have the ability to at least influence the people right around you, and maybe you're the leader in that scenario. Maybe you're the person who's doing the influencing and taking a stand. So one way that I've found to really convince CEOs in the C-suite that bullying is a thing is through a prevalence audit. So what often happens is people, you know, HR calls and they say, we need assistance. We are trying to convince the C-suite to solve this problem. They're not even seeing it as a problem, as we've said. They see this person as valuable. They're high producers. And so how do we talk to the C-suite about, you know, addressing this issue? So I'll share a story with you, this or case study. So this very scenario happened with a manufacturing plant. This HR person called and they had been hearing complaints about workplace bullying, and he could see that bullying was affecting the employees. And he was talking to the CEO about it, and the CEO keeps saying, essentially, I don't understand. I don't get it. You know, I think he's a great guy. And so, as we've also said already here on this webinar, you know, the bully was great when the CEO was around, but when he wasn't around, he really mistreated people. And so we did a prevalence audit. So a prevalence audit essentially asks questions about relationships. It doesn't ask about workplace bullying. It doesn't ask about satisfaction or employee engagement. It asks questions about employee relationships. And through that, we were able to sort of prove to the CEO that bullying was in fact a real problem. One of the big things that we were able to show was that this organization, which normally had very low turnover, it actually used to have a really great culture. It had low turnover, but in doing this audit, we discovered that actually about half of the employees were looking for a new job. So the CEO was about to get a real slap in the face when a bunch of employees all left. And so, you know, of course, we got his attention with that information. So we were able to prove that the bullying really was a problem and that it needed to be solved so that we could move forward in solving it. So a prevalence audit is 100% the way to go if you're having a hard time convincing your CEO that the bullying needs to be solved. You know, CEOs are focused on numbers. They're looking at their dashboard. And when you say to them, bullying is causing some problems, it's hindering production or whatever, if the CEO is looking at their dashboard or their Excel spreadsheets or their profit and loss statements and they're seeing that the numbers are all there, in their mind, it's like, I don't, you know, there isn't a problem. Everything looks good. So the prevalence audit is a way to prove otherwise. The third step in solving workplace bullying is creating a healthy workplace policy. Now notice I did not say an anti-bullying policy. So I do have a respectful workplace policy template. I'm happy to send it to you if you'd like. And essentially, the way that you would implement this policy is by getting the organizational members on board to help you do that. So I just want to point out that right there, acceptable and healthy workplaces, workplace behaviors are defined there in this policy. So what I recommend you do is gather up a group or all of your employees, gather up, you know, if you can have a company-wide meeting or, you know, you can do this at your next harassment training when everybody's together. And what I want you to do is break your employees up into groups of 3 or 4. And then you're going to ask your employees this one question. How would you like to be treated by your peers and managers? How would you like to be treated by your peers and managers? And then you give them about 15 minutes to brainstorm. And what happens is people will come up with a list of 10 or 15 behaviors. And then you'll go from group to group to group and you'll ask them what their answers were. What did you come up with in response to this question? How would you like to be treated by your peers and managers? And the power in this exercise is as each person gives you their answer, as each group gives their answer, what they'll discover is that every group had the same answer. So I've done this exercise several times in a lot of different organizations, and it's always the same 10 or 15 answers. People want to feel appreciated. They need to hear thank you every now and again. People want to have fun at work. They want humor. So we're people. We all want the same things. We want to be treated with respect. So then you can take those behaviors, you can sort of consolidate the list that you've collected into these 10 or 15 behaviors, and then you can put them inside your corporate policy. Now employees are being held accountable to a policy that they created. Now my policy does define bullying later. It does talk about that because that's part of it, is to, stop workplace bullying. But let's focus on what we want from people as opposed to what we don't want from people. Now, again, if you're not in HR, if you're not somebody who can influence corporate policies, you certainly can do that same exercise inside your own work team. And you can, at least come up with some ground rules inside your own work team as you're working together. How do we want to treat each other? So you can still do the exercise. It's still a powerful exercise. And you'll still find commonalities in what you're all looking for, even if you can't necessarily influence implementing a corporate policy. Okay. So the next step is to create social vision and values. So if you're a corporate influencer and you have the ability to sort of influence your C-suite, this is definitely one of the most important steps. If you're somebody who's inside of a work team, you're not necessarily near the C-suite, you can again do this inside your own work team. So let's talk about creating a social vision. A social vision, well, back up, an organizational vision is the vision statement that's on your company's website, and it tells the world where you're going, right? So if you work for a nonprofit that's focused on feeding the hunger in your community, then your vision statement's probably something around ending homelessness or ending hunger inside your own community. That's your vision. Well, a social vision is an internal statement. It does not belong on your website, and it's about your culture. And what it does is say, this is what we want our culture to be, and people who violate that culture don't fit here and they can't work here. So let me give you some examples of social visions. Method, who you may have seen in Target, that's where I don't even know if they are sold anywhere else. They're definitely sold in Target. They have innovative packaging, and they also have innovative cleaning products. So their products do not use bleach. It's sort of all natural cleaning products. They're focused on the environment. So their cleaning products are innovative and their packaging is innovative. They've decided that innovation means weirdliness, or what they call weirdliness. I don't think that's even a word. But what they're focused on is that everybody in the organization has to be weird. And if you're not weird, you can't work here. And that's okay, because if I'm not weird enough, I don't want to be working among a group of people who don't think I'm weird enough, who don't think I fit in. At Method, they believe that being weird really is about being yourself, and if you're allowed to be yourself and speak openly, then you can be more innovative, which is ultimately what they're getting at with this whole weirdliness thing. Weirdliness shows up everywhere at Method. The way their office is decorated is weird. Their interviews involve questions around how are you weird. They sort of examine your weirdness to make sure you fit in. And in the context of bullying, and I don't know if they have an anti-bullying policy or healthy workplace policy or not, but I will say I do know that because Method is so focused on their culture, it's a huge part of how they function. that if bullying started to happen at Method, it would immediately be stopped, because if somebody feels bullied, they can't be themselves, they can't be their full weirdness, and bullying would stand out like a sore thumb at Method. So the culture keeps certain behaviors out and allows certain behaviors to thrive. I'm just curious, Skip, how are you feeling about all of this? Does this resonate with your work as well? I'm assuming it does.
Oh, absolutely it does. And, we do similar work in this regard. And, I'm in the middle of getting ready to release a report called How to Create Your Ideal Work Environment. And it's very similar to the strategies that you're suggesting here. Some of the questions are different, but they absolutely get to the same place. And the one thing that I just keep coming back to that I'd like for you to address at some point is the article I referred you to regarding to the whole civil policies from the NLRB and some of
Yes.
their rulings and the legality of the language that you can use for some of these quote policies. I found that issue to be really fascinating
Yeah,
and
so
scary in the same.
yeah, let's talk about that right now since you brought it up and we were just talking
Okay.
about a healthy workplace policy. So yes, the NLRB came up with uh, this new ruling where they said that if you have a civility policy, and they've actually done this once before regarding a code of conduct, they've said that if you require employees to be civil or happy or act in a positive way, that you're inhibiting their ability to engage in concerted activities or organize into unions. And their point is that in order for unions to form, people have to be unhappy. That's why unions happen, right? That people feel unhappy in their work environment. They want certain things to happen. The employer isn't giving it to them. And so they seek out unionizing as a way to solve that problem and get what they need. And the NLRB is focused on protecting the right to organize and to have a union. So yes, a lot of people were very shocked when the NLRB came out and said, you can't have a civility policy. It violates people's right to organize. On the flip side, the EEOC, which is the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, that's the group, it's a government agency that manages harassment and discrimination complaints. So if you felt harassed or discriminated at work, you would file a complaint with the EEOC, and they would try to help you resolve it. And then they're the ones that actually decide whether or not you can go to court. So the EEOC says, yes, we think you have a legal case, you may go to court, or no, you cannot go to court. And the EEOC just had a task force that they had created to try to understand what's happening with harassment and whether training programs work, and they were really analyzing sort of everything they're doing and what's working and what's not working. The EEOC literally just a couple months ago, and it was almost right, it was like within a week of the NLRB's ruling, the EEOC came out and said a civility policy is something they highly recommend and that it would help solve the problem of harassment and discrimination. So with that, what I would say is you do have the right to have a civility policy. Certainly, you would have your employment law attorney approve it for you and make sure that it's not violating rights. And ultimately, you'd have to be very clear that while you do support employees' right to unionize and organize and engage in concerted activity, that you still have the right to control behavior on some level. So and you still have the right to have a certain kind of culture and say that this is the culture that's going to drive our business forward. So that's the answer. There is no answer.
Yeah.
Actually, I teach an HR class, and we had a employment law attorney speak at our class last week, and she made the comment that obviously her clients ask her to review corporate policies for them. And she said often, very often, she'll get back to the client and say, here's my answer. I'm 80% sure that this policy is legal. So there's so much in and out, and just so many minute details that in the end, you do have the right to dictate your employees' behavior, but you don't have the right to take away their ability to unionize. So it's all in the semantics, I think, of your corporate policy.
Right, and I also think it comes back to, it almost comes full circle back to the culture, whereas if you have a culture that has open communication and people are able to have these type of ongoing dialogues and everything, and people are open to sort of constructive feedback, coming from the right perspective and couched in the right way, that will go a long way to avoiding any issues, right? As
Yeah.
opposed to things where bullying or harassment sort of shuts those type of conversations down. It's just like I always come back to some of the studies that have shown that doctors or lawyers that have really good bedside manner or really good communication skills rarely are sued for malpractice,
There,
right?
right,
Because
exactly.
they still have done the right things, they've communicated the right way, and they build rapport and trust with their people. Whereas the doctors or the attorneys who don't do that, they don't have the relationship, and so they get sued. Same thing.
Yeah, that makes sense. And so I'm right there with you. If you have a certain kind of culture, then people are going to be less inclined to unionize because they fit into that culture. So yeah, culture, I believe, is the end-all be-all of your organization's success. I see one question. Am I going to show the 10 steps again in a summary? I'm actually not, Susan, but I can certainly go over them as we come to a close. And also, you will get a recording of the webinar, so that should help as well. So one other example of this, Southwest is another company that's really known for their culture, and they actually have 3 corporate values, which are warrior spirit, servant's heart, and fun-loving attitude. And again, Southwest really pushes these 3 values. You have to live and breathe them in order to work there. In their interviews, I've heard that, they require you to sort of be funny and tell jokes, and if you're not that way, then they don't hire you. That's part of the requirement to be there. And so, you have to fit into a certain mold in order to work at Southwest, and that's the reason they win customer service awards year after year after year. And the reason they're able to keep their prices lower. So one other example of how this looks is or how to do this. I worked with a company who they were a nonprofit, and their job in their community was to help people with disabilities thrive. So they felt like if we can help people who live in our community thrive, whatever that looks like for that person, then we can help bring them in the community and make them a part of the community we live in. And so they realized that they had a pretty serious bullying problem, and they realized it was hindering their ability to work with their clients. If they're not thriving themselves, then how can they help the people with disabilities that they're working with thrive? And so they created a committee, and I worked with that committee, and through that we came up with the social vision of Thrive. That was their social vision. So now everything that they're doing related to their culture is focused on thriving. And they did it with the the lowercase I, because it looks like a little person. So ultimately, it's just a reminder. This is all about each of us inside the organization. So the way the social vision was created is the committee came up with several ideas after doing the exercise I described. They collected all of these behaviors from all of the employees, and then with that information, they sort of whittled it down to several options, and then they sent those options out to the organization, and they voted on Thrive. From there, we created some social values, or some corporate values, and those values again came from the behaviors from that exercise. So that exercise is really important to getting to this point. So now we have our social vision, we know what the point is that we're trying to get to, what we're trying to be with our culture, and now we have corporate values that drive that behavior. Well, that's all fine and dandy. A lot of organizations have corporate values, but a lot of organizations don't use the corporate values, and that's why they ultimately have bullying, right? So from there, you have to develop action items around those values so that you're sure that people are living them. So this is a really great quote. It's easier to act your way into a new way of thinking than it is to think your way into a new way of acting. So the point is that if you can get people to start acting in a way that aligns with your new culture, they'll start thinking in line with your new culture. You can't ask people to start thinking about their culture differently and then expect them to change their behavior. It goes the other way around. Get people to behave differently and they'll start thinking differently. So in creating your action items, they have to be SMART, and you've probably seen SMART before. They have to be specific, measurable, attainable, results-oriented, and time-focused. And let me give you some examples of some very simple action items. Now, again, these are action items that you can certainly implement inside your own work team. You don't have to be the VP of HR to implement these things. So these are, anybody can sort of implement these in their own work team. So one example might be to start talking with your fellow employees and peers about what a healthy workplace looks like and what kind of projects or things can you do around that healthy workplace. So for example, if one of your new corporate values is going to be service, maybe a healthy workplace project would be to go volunteer together on a Saturday, go do a Habitat for Humanity project or something. So, what are some things that we can do around this new workplace we're trying to build? Another example is to start your staff meetings off with thank you. So this is a great small thing. It costs you nothing. All you have to do is at the beginning of your staff meeting say, I'd like us to start off with thank you. Does anybody have anything they want to say? And people will start to open up, and there'll be minor things. They'll say things like, well, you know what, Frank, thanks for always being in a good mood. You're funny and I appreciate it, so thank you. And then someone else will say, you know what, yesterday, John really helped me with my issue with a customer, and so I appreciated that. Thank you, John, for doing that. And they're just minor things, and they make a big difference in how the meeting unfolds and how people start to treat each other. Another example, create and obtain personal pledges for positive communication. So you can sort of create this promise that everybody's going to start acting in the way that's in line with the new culture and get people to sign it, just as a way to sort of solidify it in their mind. A final example is, or another example is to start holding discussions about different things. For example, constructive feedback, what does professionalism look like, those kinds of things. So, you can definitely just start having conversations about what kinds of behaviors are we supposed to be engaging in. Some other examples, if you have a best place to work winner somewhere in your area, you can definitely go and visit them. People love to talk about themselves. So if you call them up and say, can we come visit you? We want to talk about your award. They'll be happy to do so. So that's a way to learn some things. You could do a best self exercise. So this is another free option, doesn't take a ton of time. What you would do is send out an email to all of your staff, and you would list everybody's name in the email. At the top of the email, you'd say, below is the list of all of the people you work with. Please write in one thing you're thankful for or one thing you appreciate in each of the people on the list below. And people should send that list back to you directly. You'll take that list and you'll consolidate, and then you can share that with each staff member. So for example, and sorry, I just use John and Susan a lot. Those are sort of my go-to names. So I'll have a list of everything that people said about John, and then I'll be able to consolidate all of that into one Word document, and then I can give it to John. And so at a staff meeting in front of everyone, I could say, John, here's what everybody said about you, and now here's a piece of paper that you can go put on your cubicle wall. So how nice would it be to have a piece of paper that lists things that everybody appreciate in me? So that's another example. Another example, create a lunch and learn schedule. Again, this is free. Whatever your new corporate values are, people can deliver, staff members or departments can deliver, a 30-minute training on what that corporate value means or what it is or how to engage in it. Just another way to keep the conversation going. One other example, I love this one, plaster your lunchroom or some wall with butcher paper. Just tape butcher paper up there and then let people graffiti on the wall. And so or you could even let people graffiti right on the wall. A can of paint is like $12, and then you can paint over it later if you decide to. But this way, people have the opportunity to sort of celebrate success. Last example, another free one. Everybody's got a cell phone. You can ask people to just create a little 20-second video about living the corporate values. How will you live those values? And then you can mesh them together on YouTube, and voila, you've got a video of all of your employees talking about the corporate values. I'm getting a question if you're going to get a copy of the slides. Yes, you will, and you also get a copy of the recording, or we'll send the recording out. So don't worry, I got you. Okay, so using this company as an example where we created Thrive as their social value or their social vision, and then we created new corporate values, we really made a big difference. So this is absolutely one way to solve the problem of bullying. And in fact, the executive director called me and told me that the 2 worst perpetrators quit within 6 months of working through this exercise. So this, I know, absolutely works. Just a tip in doing this: celebrate small wins as things happen. So as little successes happen after you go out and volunteer together, for example, or after you achieve one of your projects that you're doing, celebrate it. Make sure that you stop and celebrate and enjoy the fact that you're making a difference in your organization's culture. The next step is to provide training on the topic of workplace bullying. Absolutely. So employees need to know what bullying is, why it's bad, how it compares to harassment. Certainly that needs to be a conversation. But they should also have training on positive workplace communication skills. They should have training on conflict management, stress management. Again, you have to talk about the things that you want from employees in addition to the things that you don't want. So if you're going to create a healthy workplace policy, you have to provide training on what those behaviors look like in order to help ensure that people engage in those behaviors. One way to ensure that people do actually engage in the new behaviors is to attach learning objectives to their rewards. So for example, if your employees attend a communication skills training and they learn how to ask the right questions or how to give feedback, then giving feedback should show up in their performance management somewhere. It should either be on their annual performance evaluation or on a coaching document somewhere or something, so that now that they've learned this skill, they're being held accountable to actually engaging in it. Managers need separate training. Managers also need training on how to set expectations for behavior, how to manage bullies, how to coach, bullies, and how to create a positive workplace. So your managers need extra training on how to ensure that the organization can make culture change. And again, managers need to be held accountable to what they learned, and you can certainly, and I absolutely recommend that you attach the work environment or the culture inside each and every department to manager rewards, so that at the end of the year, for example, if a department has a really exemplary, sort of positive culture, then that manager should be rewarded. So just some examples. And again, I've done this training several times in many organizations, and here's one example. I know this works. I did this for a certain training for an emergency room in a hospital, and it worked so well that we ended up doing the training in several other departments too. So having training sometimes can just help create awareness, but again, you have to hold people accountable. Speaking of holding people accountable, the 7th step is performance management, and just a couple tips there. Understand your top performers, and by top performers, I mean those that are not bullying. As we said, there are many top performers who are bullies. We don't want to emulate them. We want to emulate the top performers who engage in positive workplace behaviors. So I recommend spending some time with those people, the corporate champions or the corporate heroes, the people that really emulate what you want your culture to be. Spend time with those people, understand why they're that way, how they came to be that way, what motivates them to be that way, and then try to find people who are just like them. Try to create, clones of those people. How do you get other people to behave like them? And so, spend time understanding those people. Everybody needs to have expectations about how they're supposed to behave. Those core values that you created using the exercise I talked about, those should show up in your performance evaluations or any other performance measures, so people are measured on whether or not they live the core values. Reward the people who are emulating the culture you're looking for. And again, managers need to always be available, and they need to know how to provide ongoing coaching. Just because someone is a manager, it doesn't mean they're good at coaching or setting expectations. So they need that training that I was talking about. Step 8 is to coach bullies. Now, this is probably the most sort of obvious step, but probably the least used. Ultimately, as we said, bullies bully because they don't really know any other way, and they don't, they've learned that bullying works for them. So you can't just go to them and say you have to stop behaving like that, because they don't know what else to do. They don't know how else to behave. So and ultimately, use discipline. So if they're not adjusting towards your new culture, then they need to be disciplined up to and including termination. They don't fit in anymore, and it's okay to send them on their way. The ninth step is to use your grievance process. So, if you are in HR and you're listening in, employees are not reporting bullying to you because they don't know what your reaction will be. If you haven't made it clear that you're willing to stand up against bullying, then they're not coming to you. And they're afraid. They don't know what your reaction will be. So you've got to communicate with your organization that you are absolutely interested in taking in grievances. The other thing is, well, I'll share a story with you. So this actually happened to a friend of mine. She was the VP of Learning and Development for a credit union, and she used to report directly to the CEO. Well, as the credit union grew, they got in a senior VP of HR. So now this director of learning and development, instead of reporting directly to the CEO, she's now reporting to the SVP of HR. So now there's someone in between them. And as we've said, this SVP, I'm certain, felt threatened by my friend, the director of learning and development. She felt threatened by her relationship with the CEO. Here this SVP is right in between these two people who are clearly great friends and have a wealth of respect for each other. And so she was bullying, the SVP was bullying my friend, the director of learning and development. And she went to the CEO and said, I feel bullied, I'm looking for help. And the CEO said, well, let's get an investigation. I'll hire an attorney and we'll get them in here. And the attorney was looking for illegal behavior. So the attorney didn't understand workplace bullying, and the attorney filed a report with the CEO that said there's nothing illegal going on here. So the CEO goes back to my friend and says, the attorney says there's nothing illegal going on here, there's nothing I can do to help you. And she's like, my friend is like, I told you it's not illegal. I told you it was bullying. I know it's not harassment. And the CEO gave her no choice. She had to quit because of the CEO's reaction. He wasn't willing to put a stop to the bullying. So I guess what I'm saying is, recognize that just because it's not illegal, it's still there. And if you do hire an investigator, it does have to be somebody who understands workplace bullying, and that just because it's illegal, it doesn't mean, or it's not illegal, it doesn't mean it doesn't exist. So then the last step is to lather, rinse, repeat. Try things, try them out, see if they work. If they don't work, try something different. And there will be a lot of massaging and, making sure that things work. So you'll have to tweak. Actually, Skip, I see a question. As a project manager, can a person receive their credits from a webinar on the topic of bullying? I would assume so. Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, my understanding of PMI and getting their continuing ed, PDU credits, there's different categories that they can apply under. In this type of training, since neither you or I are a registered education provider, PMI people, if they want to apply for it, can use, I think it's category B or category C level PDU, but they're going to have to investigate that. I do have a PDU activity reporting form that they can use. If they want me to send it to them, I can do that.
Okay, so there's your answer, Arthur. Make sure you email Skip and he'll send you the the response. So I just wanted to offer you all something as we come to a close here. And, I'm just curious what you're thinking about everything you've learned so far. Where are you at? How are you feeling about this stuff? And Skip, maybe you have some sort of comments about where you're at with all of this stuff as well, as people are typing in.
Yeah, thanks. I think this stuff makes so much sense. Again, it's a lot of similar type of work that I do in smaller organizations, and I just think we're at work at least a third of our lifetime, right? 8 hours a day or more, even more than we spend at home, and to have a negative workplace that we go to every day that we don't enjoy is just such a waste of too much time in our lives. Right? Life is too short for this stuff, and if we want something different, we have to be our own, figure out our own way to influence it. And one of the things that I find is there's too much dancing around things in the workplace. There's people are walking on eggshells. People are not addressing the elephant, the gorilla in the room. And one of my deadliest sins of communication in the workplace is a lack of directness and candor. And I think you've got to, people that are experiencing this, and if this resonated with you, you've got to take some action to do something to create the environment that you want, or choose to move out of it. And you always have that option as well. And so I think, Catherine, your steps here are spot on. There's the process that you can use to influence your work environment, and if you're not happy in it or you're experiencing bullying and harassment, you need to step up and do something about it, because life is too short.
That's right. That's right. So thank you for those comments. And I've had a couple questions to repeat the 10 steps over. So let me go ahead and do that. So step 1 is to get leadership on board. Step 2 is to do the prevalence audit, and those 2 steps go hand in hand. Step 3 was to implement a healthy workplace policy. Step 4 was to create a social vision and the corresponding values. Step 5 was to develop an action plan around those values. Step 6 is to provide training. Step 7 is to use your performance management processes. Step 8 is to coach bullies. Step 9 is to take grievances. And then step 10 is to lather, rinse, repeat. So here's what I want to offer you. You might be feeling like you're here, that you've got a long, dark road ahead of you in the process of solving workplace bullying, and that you want to be here, over at the other end where you've got your happy social vision and where people can thrive. And you may have showed up because you're tired of trying to figure out how to get people to stop dragging your company down. I know in my own situation, I was so sick of taking in complaints and having them fall on deaf ears when I would talk to the president about it, that I just got tired of trying to keep the company afloat. You might want to do more of what you love. So if you're spending all of your time solving bullying, you're not able to do the things you love, and dealing with negativity is certainly exhausting. You might feel like you have the power to make the lives of the people in your workplace better, and that you might be that person who can really rise up and make a huge difference for the people that you work with, and that you have the power to create an organization where people thrive, where they love what they do, and where they respect each other. And it is really time to make a difference. I have seen so many scenarios where workplace bullying is so damaging for the people at the other end, and it's time to make a change. And remember that nothing that I've shared with you today is theory. Everything is proven. I guarantee that it works, and I guarantee that because of my own experience, and I can guarantee it because other experts in the field of culture and in the field of workplace bullying agree that these are the kinds of things that need to happen in order to make a culture change and in order to solve the problem of bullying. And you might be thinking, where do you begin? I've given you these 10 steps. I gave you a ton of information today, but you may not necessarily feel ready to jump right in and really make a difference. And maybe you're sort of like, if you do start to jump in and make a change, that it could take you quite a while before you got through that process, versus if you had someone like me by your side to kind of help speed up the process, because I know what I'm doing, and I've been doing it for a long time. And so I wanted to give you a gift, and normally people on webinars try to sell you something. I'm actually going to give you something for free, so this is not a sales pitch. What I'm offering is a free prevalence audit. Now it'll be a simple prevalence audit. It won't be a full-fledged audit, but I'm happy to do a 5-question free prevalence audit. And what will happen is you and I will talk on the phone. We'll come up with some ideas for those 5 questions, and then I will help you send that survey out. And once the survey is complete, you'll get a report from me with some responses and some ideas for action items. So again, the way the process will work is that you will just have to send 2 emails. So you and I will have a call. We'll come up with questions. You'll send an email out with a link to your survey, and then you'll send a second email out right before it closes. And then from there, you'll get a report from me, that's just combining the responses and offering a recommendation. So again, a 5-step or a 5-question prevalence audit for free. Here's an example of what that recommendation page might look like. So here's the report and what it might be. And then from there, I will give you a list of recommendations, and you can either, go forth and do those recommendations on your own or use me, whatever works for you. But we can work through this stuff together, and I can help you create an organization where people are thriving. And so whether you ultimately want to work with me or not is irrelevant. You will get a free prevalence audit whether we work together or not after the audit. I'm offering the audit to you for free, no strings attached. Just know that if you do work with me to solve the problem of bullying, I do guarantee my consulting services. So I know the 10 steps work 100%, and so I can guarantee my response or my ability to help you. So what I'd like for you to do is, if you're interested in the audit, type yes in the question box, and then I will be able to reach out to you within the next 24 hours, and we can have a conversation about the audit. So if you type yes in the question section right now, I will reach out to you, and then we can have a conversation, and then if it is something you're interested in, we can move forward. So if you say yes, again, what will happen is I will email you to set up a quick call. I'll create the questions for your review based on what we talk about in the call. You'll send that survey link out. I'll collect the responses, and I will provide a report to you. And then I can also have a conversation with you about kind of how to present that report to your boss. So I'm seeing a couple yeses coming through, so I'm certainly happy to help you with that. We've got a little bit of time for Q&A. We said the presentation will go to 11:30, so we've got 4 minutes. If anybody has any final questions they want to ask. Let's see here. I'm seeing a couple comments come through, so let me see see if there's questions in here. I live in Minnesota, and people from other states think it's just Minnesota nice, but it has been so long since I've lived in other places, I'm not sure. I'm not 100% sure about your comment. Are you saying that because you're from Minnesota, people are kind of saying, well, that's just how it is in Minnesota, that's not the way it is in another state? Or maybe clarify that for me. Someone else says, this does exist in my workplace. I think there's some helpful tips here that I can use to address the problem, and I will try to make the bullies part of a larger group to listen to the recording. Oh, perfect. That would be awesome. Get everybody to listen to the recording. Okay, I see. So the comment about Minnesota is that people in Minnesota maybe avoid conflict? I guess I'm still not sure.
Well, it's funny. I spoke in Minnesota about 1.5 years ago and had a really nice conversation around the dinner table before I spoke about that Minnesota mindset. And I think what she's probably saying is exactly that, but it also comes off as very passive-aggressive, I think.
Gotcha. So. Okay, gotcha. Okay. Any other questions? Or a yes. If you want yes, or if you want the audit, type in yes, and I'm happy to get on the phone with you. We can talk about doing that. Questions, yeses, final comments?
Well, Catherine, I have one question, I guess, just for some clarification. Maybe this might be helpful for some folks on the webinar as well. Do you have just an idea? You said you create this prevalence audit with some questions, up to 5 questions. Can you give a sample of what some of those questions are that you typically use?
Sure. So I'm doing a couple of them right now. Some of the questions there are, do you feel like your director trusts you? Do you feel like your team members value you? So they're based on whatever's happening specifically. So for example, in one place where I'm doing the audit, it's one person on a team of 23 that's really hindering the production, and actually they've seen a lot of turnover lately. And so one of the questions we asked is around, it's just an open-ended question. You've noticed that there's been some turnover. We're curious about your thoughts on that, and just to see what people say. So the questions never actually, say, do you feel bullied or is there
Right.
bullying? They're all questions that are general enough that we can understand what's happening with the bullying, but we still may also find some other things too. So one of the audits I did recently that was just one of these free 5-question ones, we discovered that people really weren't getting feedback. So that was the lowest score question was, do you get positive
Mm-hmm.
feedback from the people, or do you get feedback of, what was it? Do you get feedback about what you're doing well? So, that we learned a lot of people, something like 80% of people said no, they'd never get that information. So now that's something we can fix. So yeah, it just gives you an opportunity to learn a little bit about what's
Right.
happening within your team.
Great. Yeah. No, thanks for sharing that. Good.
Yeah. All right, so I see a couple more yeses coming through, so I will contact you all. And with that, I guess we'll call it quit. So thanks again, Skip, for having me in front of your e-newsletter list. So I really appreciate the opportunity to share what I know about bullying, and hopefully I've been able to help give some people some tips about things they can do.
Yeah, obviously with the people who are saying yes and asking questions and engaging, you've struck a nerve and you've given people things to think about and to act on to improve their work environment. And I think this has been great. It's been a learning experience for me, stuff that I can add to the work that I do. And I appreciate you investing the time in my audience and sharing your tips and strategies. And I know the world will be a better place because of it. So thanks so
Oh,
much.
thanks. All right. Well, thanks so much. I hope everyone has a great evening, afternoon, morning, whatever it is.
All right.
Thanks again.
Bye, everybody.